The number should have been 7 million. I had calculated it 4 times, verified each variable against the sector tithe records, and the grain production output for Viridian Quintus should have read 7 million tons. The data slate displayed 6.3. A discrepancy of 700,000 tons might seem inconsequential against the scale of Imperial logistics, but discrepancies do not simply occur. Numbers either align with reality or they indicate corruption, incompetence, or catastrophe. I flagged the entry for review and moved to the next world in my assigned sector cluster, not yet understanding that I had taken my first step off a cliff whose bottom I would never reach. My name is Travis Mercer, and for 11 years I served as a tertiary analysis clerk in the Strategic Logistics Division of Battlefleet Pacificus, stationed aboard the Administrative Fortress satellite designated Calculus 7 in orbit above the Forge world Graia. My function was straightforward. Data from across 47 systems filtered through my cogitator station daily, and I organized this information into digestible summaries for my superiors, who in turn condensed it further for their superiors, and so on up the chain until some fraction of the original truth reached the Lord Admiral's strategic planning staff. I was proud of my work. I believed I served the Emperor through precision, through the meticulous ordering of information that allowed his fleets to defend humanity against the endless darkness. I believed the discrepancies I found were errors to be corrected, not symptoms of something far worse. The morning cycle after I flagged the Viridian report, I found 3 more anomalies. Troop deployment figures for the Damocles Gulf showed 17 regiments where my previous quarter's data indicated 23. Munitions production from the Lathe worlds had declined by 8% without any corresponding explanation in the administrative notes. Ship repair. Schedules at the Hydra Fur dockyards listed vessels I could not locate in any active fleet registry. Each irregularity was minor in isolation. Each felt like a typographical error or a filing misfeasance. I documented them all, submitted my queries through proper channels, and waited for the corrections that would restore the numbers to their proper alignment. The corrections never came. Instead, I received a priority communique from my direct supervisor, Coordinator Elsbeth Vance, requesting my presence in her office compartment at 1400 hours, ship standard. The message contained no explanation, no context, no indication of whether I had performed admirably or committed some infraction. I spent the intervening hours reviewing my work for errors, finding none, and arrived at her door precisely on time with my stomach churning in a way I attributed to the recycled air filtration rather than anxiety. Coordinator Vance was a woman of 63 standard years, her face lined with the particular weariness that comes from spending decades staring at data slates in artificial light. She had served the administratum since before my birth, rising through the ranks with the steady persistence of someone who understood that advancement in the imperial bureaucracy came not from brilliance but from survival. When I entered her office, she was standing at her viewport, staring out at the distant blue glow of Graia's forges, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture I had never seen her adopt before. She did not turn around when she spoke. "The discrepancies you flagged yesterday," she said, her voice flat and careful. "How did you notice them?" I explained my methodology, cross-referencing tithe reports against historical projections, comparing fleet deployment data against shipyard output schedules, the standard verification protocols I had performed every day for 11 years. She was silent for a long moment. Then she asked a question that would hollow out the foundations of everything I believed. "Have you ever wondered why your queries never receive corrections?" I had wondered. In the beginning. But wonder fades when it produces no answers, and I had learned to attribute the silence to bureaucratic inefficiency, to the vast distances of space that made communication slow, to the simple truth that the administratum was too large and too overburdened to respond to every minor concern from every minor clerk. I told her this, and she finally turned to face me, and the expression in her eyes was something I did not recognize. It was not anger or disappointment or concern. It was the look of someone who has carried a weight for so long that they have forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. "The discrepancies are not errors," she said. "They are policy. I did not understand. I said as much. Policy, I repeated, as if the word itself might reveal its meaning through repetition. Coordinator Vance walked to her desk, unlocked a secure drawer with a biometric scan, and withdrew a data slate that looked no different from any other. She handed it to me without ceremony, without explanation, and gestured for me to read. The document was marked with 17 different classification seals, each one indicating a higher level of security clearance than I possessed. The header identified it as a strategic assessment prepared for the Lord High Admiral of Battlefleet Pacificus, dated 3 years prior. I should not have been reading it. The fact that Coordinator Vance was showing it to me meant either that she trusted me implicitly or that she had already decided my future was irrelevant. I read. The first paragraph described projected losses across the Pacificus segmentum for the following decade. The second paragraph compared these projections against available reinforcement schedules. The third paragraph contained a single sentence that I read 4 times before its meaning penetrated the fortress of my assumptions. Current strategic. Modeling indicates that defensive capabilities across 63% of the segmentum will fall below sustainable thresholds within 15 years, absent substantial reallocation of resources from other segmentum commands. I looked up at Coordinator Vance. She had returned to her position at the viewport, her back to me once again, as if she could not bear to watch my face as I processed what I was reading. The document continued for 47 pages. Each page was worse than the last. It detailed losses along the eastern fringe that exceeded official reports by a factor of 3. It described evacuation protocols for worlds that Imperial propaganda still claimed were firmly under control. It referenced something called the Adjusted Reporting Protocol, a systematic methodology for modifying data before it reached upper command levels to prevent what the document called cascade demoralization effects among strategic planning staff. The Imperium was not merely struggling. The Imperium was bleeding from wounds it could not close, and the blood was being hidden beneath layer after layer of falsified reports and adjusted figures and optimistic projections that bore no relationship to reality. I set the data slate down on Coordinator Vance's desk. My hands were steady. I remember being surprised by that, by the physical calm that did not match the chaos expanding inside my skull. "How long?" I asked. "How long has this been happening?" She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was softer than I had ever heard it, stripped of the professional detachment that usually armored her words. The Adjusted Reporting Protocol was implemented during the Third War for Armageddon. It was meant to be temporary, a measure to maintain morale during a crisis. But the crisis never ended, Clerk Mercer. It simply became the baseline. The Third War for Armageddon had concluded over a century ago. More than 100 years of falsified data, more than 100 years of strategic decisions made based on information that was systematically designed to be wrong. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. I was a tertiary clerk. My security clearance did not remotely authorize access to documents of this classification level. My position in the hierarchy was so minor that I doubted anyone above Coordinator Vance even knew my name. She finally turned to face me again. "Because you noticed," she said. "In 11 years you are the first analyst in my division to flag discrepancies consistently enough to trigger a review. Most people see what they expect to see. Most people accept the numbers they are given because questioning them requires effort, and effort requires caring, and caring in this position is a pathway to madness." She paused, and something that might have been a smile crossed her face, though it was too bitter to carry any warmth. "I have watched you, Clerk Mercer. You care, you verify, you question, and now you know enough to be dangerous." I did not feel dangerous. I felt as if the deck plating had dissolved beneath my feet, and I was falling through vacuum, grasping for handholds that did not exist. "What happens now?" I asked. Coordinator Vance retrieved the data slate from her desk and returned it to its secure drawer. "Now you have a choice. You can continue your work as before, pretending you never read that document, contributing to the adjusted reports like everyone else in this division. You will be promoted in time. You will retire with honors. You will die believing you serve the Emperor well." She locked the drawer and met my eyes with an intensity that felt like a physical pressure. "Or you can learn more. You can see the full scope of what we are hiding. And you will spend the rest of your career carrying knowledge that will poison every moment of your existence." I should have chosen ignorance. Any rational person would have recognized that some truths are too heavy to bear, that there is no virtue in understanding a doom you cannot prevent. But I have never been particularly rational. I have always needed to know. And so I made the choice that would destroy me, and I asked Coordinator Vance to show me everything. The education took weeks. Coordinator Vance fed me documents in careful doses, each one building upon the last, each one stripping away another layer of the comforting lies I had believed for my entire life. I learned that the data I processed every day passed through 7 separate filtering stages before reaching my cogitator station, each stage removing information deemed too demoralizing for analysts at my clearance level. I learned that the tithe discrepancies I had flagged represented not errors but actual shortfalls. Worlds that could not meet their quotas because their populations had been decimated by Xenos attacks that official reports classified as minor incursions successfully repelled. I learned that the missing regiments in the Damocles Gulf had not been redeployed or reorganized, but had simply ceased to exist, their destruction attributed in official records to training accidents or administrative reassignments. The architecture of deception was staggering in its complexity. It was not a single conspiracy, but rather an emergent property of the Imperial system itself. 1,000 small adjustments made by 1,000 different functionaries, each one believing they were protecting morale, or preventing panic, or simply making the numbers look better for their superiors. The adjusted reporting protocol was merely the formalization of something that had been happening organically for millennia. The Imperium had been lying to itself for so long that no one could any longer distinguish the truth from the fabrication. But even this knowledge was not the worst of what Coordinator Vance would show me. The worst came on the 17th day of my education, when she granted me access to the Strategic Collapse Modeling Archives. The archives were stored on isolated cogitator cores in a section of Calculus 7 that I had not known existed, a chamber buried deep within the fortress, Satellite's administrative spire, and accessible only through 3 separate security checkpoints. The room itself was unremarkable, merely another grey metal compartment lined with data stacks and illuminated by the cold light of overhead lumens. But what those data stacks contained was a complete and unfiltered assessment of the Imperium's military position across all 5 segmentums. I spent 3 days reading. I did not sleep. I barely ate. The information consumed me in the way that only true horror can, demanding my attention even as it destroyed my capacity to process what I was seeing. The Eastern Fringe was not merely threatened by Tyranid incursions, it was being systematically devoured. The official reports described Hive Fleet Leviathan as a significant threat requiring substantial resource allocation. The strategic collapse modeling indicated that Leviathan was merely one tendril of a migration pattern so vast that even the most optimistic projections showed complete consumption of the Ultima Segmentum within 600 years. 600 years might seem like an eternity to a mortal lifespan, but in the scale of galactic warfare, it was nothing. It was tomorrow. The forces of chaos were not being contained at the Eye of Terror. They were expanding slowly but inexorably, a cancer metastasizing through the Imperium's flesh. Worlds that had been stable for millennia were falling to corruption. Cults were proliferating faster than the Inquisition could suppress them, and the great rift that had torn the galaxy in half had not merely divided Imperial territory, but had fundamentally altered the balance of power in ways that the propaganda could not acknowledge. The Xenos were not being held at bay. The Orcs were massing in numbers that exceeded anything in recorded history. The Necrons were awakening across thousands of tomb worlds simultaneously. The Tau, dismissed in official communications as a minor border nuisance, were expanding at a rate that would see them controlling more territory than the Imperium within 3 centuries. And everywhere, The numbers told the same story. Losses exceeding recruitment, production declining faster than consumption, worlds falling faster than they could be reclaimed. The Imperium was not struggling through a difficult period. The Imperium was dying, had been dying for centuries, and the only thing preventing that death from becoming immediate collapse was a vast machinery of denial that convinced everyone from the Lord Commander Solar to the lowest conscript that victory was still possible. I emerged from the archives a different person than the man who had entered. Something had broken inside me, some fundamental architecture of belief that I had not even known existed until it crumbled. I found Coordinator Vance waiting for me in the corridor outside, her face showing the same weary knowledge that I now understood I would carry until my own death. "You see it now," she said. Not a question. I could not speak. I merely nodded. She took my arm with a gentleness that surprised me and led me through the winding corridors of Calculus -7 to a small observation chamber I had never visited. The viewport looked out not at Graia, but at the stars themselves, the cold, distant points of light that represented the galaxy the Imperium claimed to rule. She gestured at the darkness between those lights, at the vast emptiness that contained more death than any human mind could comprehend. "We are not fighting to win," she said. "We have not been fighting to win for a very long time. We are fighting to delay. Every day the Imperium survives is a victory. Every world that remains under human control for another year is a miracle. The propaganda tells us that we will prevail through faith and sacrifice, that the Emperor protects, that humanity is destined to rule the stars. But the mathematics do not lie. We are losing, Clerk Mercer. We have always been losing, and the only question that remains is how long we can make the dying last." I stared at those stars, at the galaxy I had been taught to believe was humanity's birthright, and I understood for the first time the true nature of the Imperium's war. It was not a conflict that would end in victory or defeat. It was an eternal holding action, a desperate scramble to preserve something, anything for as long as possible, against forces that would ultimately consume everything. The Emperor on his golden throne was not a god marshalling his forces for final triumph. He was a lighthouse burning in an infinite darkness, and his light was growing dimmer with every passing century. "Why continue?" I asked. "If we cannot win, if the mathematics prove that humanity is doomed, why continue fighting at all? Why not simply accept the inevitable?" Coordinator Vance was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a conviction that seemed to transcend the despair of everything she had shown me. "Because we are human, and humans do not surrender. We do not go quietly into the darkness. We do not calculate the odds and accept defeat. We fight even when fighting is futile. We struggle even when struggle only delays the inevitable. We hold the line even when we know the line will eventually break." She turned to face me, and in her eyes I saw something that was not quite hope, but was not quite despair either. It was something harder, something forged in the furnace of impossible knowledge and tempered by refusal to yield. "That is what it means to serve the Imperium, Clerk Mercer. Not to believe we will win, to know we will lose, and to fight anyway." I returned to my duties the following day. I processed the same falsified data through the same adjustment protocols, producing the same optimistic summaries for the same superiors who would condense them into the same encouraging reports. But I did so with new eyes. I saw the discrepancies now not as errors to be corrected, but as wounds to be hidden. I understood that every number I processed was a small piece of a vast tapestry of denial, woven by 10,000 hands across 10,000 worlds, all working together to maintain an illusion that made continued resistance possible. The weeks that followed were the most difficult of my life. I functioned adequately, performing my tasks with the same mechanical precision I had always applied, but inside I was drowning. The knowledge I carried was a weight that pressed down on every thought, a constant presence that colored every interaction. When my colleagues discussed the war effort with optimism, I saw the lies beneath their confidence. When the propaganda broadcasts spoke of glorious victories, I knew the casualties they concealed. When the priests intoned prayers for the Emperor's protection, I wondered if even they knew how little protection remained. I began to notice others who carried the same weight, small signs invisible to those who did not know what to look for, a particular weariness in the eyes, a tendency to fall silent when certain topics arose, a habit of staring at the stars with an expression that was not wonder but grief. They were scattered throughout Calculus 7, men and women who had learned too much and now lived with the poison of truth flowing through their veins. We never spoke of what we knew, not directly, but there was a recognition between us, a silent acknowledgement of shared burden. Coordinator Vance had been right. Caring was a pathway to madness, but it was also, I came to understand, a form of courage, to see the truth and continue functioning, to know the mathematics of doom and still perform your duty, to carry the weight of forbidden knowledge without breaking. That was its own kind of service to the Emperor. We were the hidden guardians of an impossible secret, maintaining the machinery of denial that allowed 10 trillion humans to continue believing their existence mattered. 3 months after my education began, Coordinator Vance summoned me to her office once more. She looked older than when I had last seen her, as if the intervening weeks had aged her by years. She told me that she was being transferred to a position at Segmentum Command, a promotion that would take her away from Calculus 7 and into the higher echelons of the strategic planning apparatus. And she told me that she had recommended me as her replacement. "You understand what that means," she said. "You will be responsible for maintaining the adjusted reports for this entire division. You will train new analysts in the protocols of denial. You will carry the truth and ensure that it remains hidden." She studied my face with an intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. "Can you do that, Clerk Mercer? Can you become a guardian of lies in service of humanity's survival?" I thought about the question for a long time. I thought about the data slates I processed every day, the discrepancies I now understood, the vast web of falsification that kept the Imperium functioning. I thought about the stars outside my viewport and the darkness between them, the horrors that waited to consume everything humanity had built. And I thought about the people I worked alongside, the analysts who believed the reports they created, the administrators who trusted the data they received, the countless billions across the Imperium who lived their lives secure in the knowledge that they were part of something eternal and triumphant. They needed their ignorance. They needed to believe that their sacrifices mattered, that their children would inherit a future worth living, that the Emperor's light would never fade. The truth would not liberate them. It would destroy them. And so the truth had to remain hidden, buried beneath layer after layer of adjusted reports and optimistic projections, maintained by people like Coordinator Vance and people like me. I accepted the position. The years that followed were a kind of living death. I rose through the ranks of the Strategic Logistics Division, eventually commanding a staff of 47 analysts who processed data for the entirety of Battlefleet Pacificus. I trained them in the protocols. I ensured the adjustments were applied consistently. I maintained the machinery of denial with the same precision I had once applied to seeking truth. And every day, I carried the weight of what I knew, feeling it press down upon me with a pressure that never lessened. I watched the war unfold through the unfiltered data that crossed my desk. I saw the true casualty figures from the Indomitus Crusade, numbers that would have broken the spirit of every Imperial citizen if they had been made public. I tracked the silent abandonment of entire subsectors that could no longer be defended, worlds left to the mercy of Xenos and heretics, while official reports described them as undergoing scheduled population transfers. I documented the slow, inexorable contraction of human-held space, watching the borders of the Imperium shrink year by year in ways that the propaganda carefully concealed. But I also saw something else. I saw worlds that should have fallen holding on through impossible determination. I saw battles won against odds that the strategic collapse modeling had calculated as insurmountable. I saw human beings, fragile and mortal and utterly outmatched, somehow finding the strength to push back against the darkness for one more day, one more year, one more century. The mathematics said we should have fallen long ago. The mathematics could not account for the stubborn refusal of humanity to accept its own extinction. I learned in those years to find a strange kind of peace in the contradiction. We were losing, We had always been losing. The mathematics were inexorable, and no amount of courage or sacrifice could change the fundamental equations. But we were also still here. After 10,000 years of war against forces that should have annihilated us, humanity still held the stars. The Imperium still stood. The Emperor's light still burned, however dimly, in the infinite darkness. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it had to be enough. Coordinator Vance died 7 years after her transfer to Segmentum Command. The official report listed the cause as cardiac failure, but I received a private communication from one of her colleagues. A man I had never met, but who apparently knew of our connection. He told me that she had simply stopped one morning, sitting at her desk processing reports, her heart ceasing to beat without warning or explanation. The medici had found nothing wrong with her, no disease or dysfunction that could account for her sudden death. She had simply reached the end of her capacity to carry the weight. I understood. I had felt the same exhaustion myself, the accumulated pressure of years of impossible knowledge seeking any outlet it could find. The body could only sustain so much cognitive dissonance before something fundamental gave way. Coordinator Vance had lasted longer than most. She had carried the truth for over 40 years before it finally broke her. I wondered how long I would last. The answer came sooner than I expected, not through death, but through something worse. It began with a routine audit of the Strategic Collapse Modeling Archives, a periodic review I conducted annually to ensure the projections remained current. I had performed this task a dozen times before, updating the models with new data, adjusting the timelines based on recent developments, watching the numbers shift in ways that were always discouraging but never surprising. But this year, the numbers did not merely shift. They collapsed. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the great rift that had torn the galaxy in half, was expanding. Not gradually, not in the slow creep that the previous models had predicted, but exponentially. The warp. Storms that defined its boundaries were growing in intensity and frequency. Worlds that had seemed safely distant from its influence were being swallowed, and the defensive capabilities on either side of the rift were deteriorating at rates that exceeded even the most pessimistic projections from previous years. I ran the calculations 17 times. I verified every variable against primary sources. I consulted with the senior cogitator savants who maintained the modeling systems. The results were always the same. The previous projections had indicated catastrophic collapse within 6 to 8 centuries. The new models showed complete strategic failure within 150 years, not for a single segmentum. For the entire Imperium, 150 years, less than 2 lifetimes. A span of time so short that children born today might live to see the end of everything. I sealed the archives and returned to my quarters. I did not report my findings. I could not report my findings. The adjusted reporting protocol had never been designed to handle information of this magnitude. There was no way to soften these numbers, no method of adjustment that could make them palatable. The truth I had discovered would destroy the machinery of denial that kept the Imperium functioning. It would trigger the cascade demoralization that all our efforts had been designed to prevent. And so I did nothing. I sat in my quarters and stared at the viewport and watched the stars, and thought about what it meant to be the sole guardian of humanity's extinction date. The weight that had pressed down on me for years suddenly felt lighter, not because the burden had lessened, but because it had grown so massive that I could no longer feel its edges. There is a point beyond which despair becomes impossible, a threshold of horror so absolute that the mind simply refuses to process it. I had crossed that threshold, and what remained was not peace, but rather the absence of capacity for further suffering. Days passed. I performed my duties mechanically, processing data and maintaining adjustments, my body continuing to function while my mind remained suspended in a strange kind of stasis. My staff noticed nothing unusual. They saw the same coordinator Mercer they had always seen, efficient and precise and dedicated to his work. They did not know that inside that shell was a hollow space where faith used to live. It was during this period of emptiness that I made the discovery that would change everything. Not in the strategic collapse modeling archives, not in the classified reports that detailed the Imperium's slow death, in a routine tithe summary from a world I had never heard of, buried in the mundane data of agricultural output and population statistics. The world was designated Septimus Tertius, an agri-world on the edge of the Pacificus segmentum that contributed grain to 17 different systems. Utterly unremarkable, utterly forgettable, but the numbers in the report did not match any pattern I had seen before. Production was up, not slightly, not within normal variance, but substantially, a 17% increase over the previous year, in a period when most agri-worlds were showing decline. And the population figures showed corresponding growth, new births exceeding deaths for the first time in decades. I pulled historical data for Septimus Tertius, expecting to find some administrative change that explained the anomaly. A new irrigation system, perhaps, or a more efficient strain of crop. What I found instead was a pattern that extended back 30 years, a slow but steady improvement in every measurable indicator despite the broader decline in the surrounding systems. I should have dismissed it as a statistical outlier. One world among billions, its minor success irrelevant against the mathematics of extinction. But something about those numbers caught my attention, demanded my focus in a way I could not explain. I began to investigate, pulling supplementary data from every source I could access, building a picture of Septimus Tertius that went far beyond the standard tithe summaries. What I found was impossible. The world had no special resources, no technological advantages, no strategic significance that would merit unusual attention from Imperial authorities. It was simply an agri-world, populated by farmers who grew food and shipped it to wherever the administratum directed. But somewhere along the line, something had changed. The population had begun organizing differently, implementing agricultural techniques that were not in any official manual, developing social structures that prioritized efficiency and cooperation over the usual hierarchies of imperial governance. They were not rebelling. They remained loyal, paying their tithes in full and often exceeding them, but they had stopped waiting for imperial systems to function. They had started solving their own problems, building their own infrastructure, creating their own future within the framework of imperial rule, and they were thriving. I searched for other examples and found them, scattered across the segmentum, hidden in the noise of aggregate data, worlds and communities and even single hive blocks that had somehow escaped the decline. Not many, a fraction of a percent. But they existed and they shared a common characteristic. They had stopped believing the propaganda, not in the sense of rebellion or heresy, but in the sense of recognition that the Imperium was not going to save them. They had understood, on some level, what I had learned from the strategic collapse modeling, and instead of despairing, they had acted. It was such a small thing, a handful of data points against the overwhelming mathematics of extinction. But it was the first evidence I had encountered in years that suggested the models might not capture everything, that human beings, even in their billions, were not merely variables to be calculated, but agents capable of altering the equations through sheer stubborn refusal to accept their fate. I thought about Coordinator Vance and what she had told me years ago. We do not calculate the odds and accept defeat. We fight, even when fighting is futile. Perhaps the fighting mattered more than I had understood. Perhaps the mathematics of collapse were not inevitable, but merely probable, subject to revision by factors that strategic modeling could not quantify. Perhaps the Imperium was losing not because defeat was certain, but because too many of its people had stopped trying to win. I made a decision. It was not rational. It violated every protocol I had sworn to uphold. But rationality had brought me to the edge of extinction, and protocols had built the machinery of denial that was slowly strangling humanity's will to survive. It was time to try something different. I began to leak data, not the classified reports, not the strategic collapse modeling, not the information that would trigger immediate panic. I leaked the success stories, the data from Septimus Tertius and its scattered counterparts, the evidence that improvement was possible, that decline could be reversed, that human agency still mattered against the forces of destruction. I embedded these examples in the adjusted reports I prepared for my superiors. Subtle changes in framing, minor emphases on positive developments, the gradual introduction of narratives that suggested hope was not merely propaganda, but demonstrable fact. I was still lying, still maintaining the vast deception that kept the Imperium functioning, but I was lying in a different direction toward possibility rather than despair. The effects were small at first, a slightly more optimistic tone in official communications, a marginally increased allocation of resources to worlds that had shown improvement, a gradual shift in the administrative culture that began imperceptibly to reward innovation rather than merely demanding compliance. I do not know if it will make a difference. The mathematics of extinction are vast, and my manipulations are tiny ripples against an ocean of inevitability. Perhaps I am merely delaying the collapse by decades or years. Perhaps I am changing nothing at all. But I am doing something. For the first time since I read those classified reports in Coordinator Vance's office, I am acting rather than merely observing. I am contributing to the Imperium's future rather than simply documenting its decline. And that, I have discovered, is enough to make the weight bearable. I sit in my quarters now, writing this account that no one will ever read, this confession that will be sealed in the archives until long after my death. I am 53 years old, and if the current models hold, I will not live to see the final collapse. That is a mercy, I suppose. But my children might, and their children almost certainly will, and I cannot accept that their fate is already determined by equations written in a classified document. The Imperium is losing the war. It has always been losing the war. And yet we are still here, 10,000 years after logic said we should have fallen, defying mathematics through nothing more than stubborn refusal to die. Perhaps that is the truth that the strategic collapse modeling cannot capture. Perhaps humanity's survival has always depended not on strategic advantage or superior force, but on the simple, irrational conviction that tomorrow is worth fighting for. I choose to believe that. Not because the evidence supports it, not because the calculations justify it, but because believing anything else means surrendering before the battle is over. And humans do not surrender. We do not go quietly into the darkness. We fight even when fighting is futile, because fighting is what we are. The stars are cold tonight, distant points of light in an infinite darkness that will eventually swallow everything I have ever known. But I am still here. The Imperium is still here, and tomorrow I will wake up and continue my work, adjusting the data and maintaining the machinery and slowly, secretly, seeding hope into a system designed to produce despair. That is what it means to discover that the Imperium is losing the war. You learn to fight anyway,